If you follow politics online at all, you've probably found yourself looking at people on the other side and asking yourself, what is wrong with these people? Are they completely disconnected from reality? They don't even understand the basic facts of the issues, and their actions are irrational and contradictory. But most of all, they have no understanding of what your side believes and stands for. What you may be more surprised to learn is that the other side feels the same way about you. Both sides believe that the other fails to understand and actively misrepresents them. So where does this misunderstanding come from? Of course, like many problems in society today, a large part of the problem is increasing polarization. As political factions are driven further and further apart, the other side starts to become incomprehensible from your own viewpoint. But there's also a common cognitive bias that prevents either side from understanding the other, and fighting it may be one of the keys to healing the fractures in our society. Simply put, outgroup homogeneity bias is the tendency to see members of outgroups as generally more uniform than members of in-groups. For example, imagine a person watching a news report about a dangerous criminal. If they are the same race as the criminal, they are unlikely to associate the crime with the perpetrator's race. This makes sense. There are millions of people of the same race. The information that one of them is a criminal shouldn't affect our overall perception of that group. However, if the criminal is a different race, the viewer is more likely to associate the crime with the perpetrator's race, despite receiving the same information. Outgroup homogeneity bias leads them to believe that members of that race are more homogeneous, and therefore, the criminal on the news is more likely to represent their race as a whole. This has obvious implications in biases such as racism, sexism, and religious discrimination, but it also applies to things like people from different countries or cities, millennials, boomers, and zoomers, fans of rival sports teams, and, of course, members of the other side. Both sides of our political divide have bad actors, extremists, and other fringe elements. Due to social sorting, we interact with the other side less and less often, so the primary way we learn about them is through the media. And because the media profits from outrage and controversy, they tend to promote stories about the most extreme views and worst actors of the other side. Outgroup homogeneity bias then leads us to believe that these fringes comprise a large portion, or even the majority of our political opponents. As a result, we increasingly see our outgroups through the lens of their most extreme members. Over time, each side's understanding of the other completely diverges from that group's understanding of itself. In this way, outgroup homogeneity bias compromises our ability to understand the other side, as well as their ability to understand us. Those on the right often claim that the left wants to shut down free speech, using the government to censor unpopular opinions and offensive ideas. However, a majority of Democrats oppose hate speech laws and those limiting offensive speech against minorities. They also oppose government censorship aimed at fighting misinformation at similar rates as those on the right, and are actually more likely to support free speech in the form of peaceful protests. So where does this perception come from? Right-wing media focuses on extreme elements that do oppose free speech, and outgroup homogeneity bias leads viewers to believe that all or most people on the left hold those views. Similarly, those on the left often feel as though racism is ubiquitous on the right. Yet polls consistently show fairly minor differences in racist attitudes between the political parties, and racist sentiments decreasing in both groups. And despite the narratives about white resentment, in both the 2016 and 2020 elections, Trump did worse with white voters and better with minority voters than past Republican candidates. Similar to the perception of free speech attitudes on the left, Racist elements do exist on the right in greater numbers, but the difference is exaggerated by partisan media and the effects of outgroup homogeneity bias. You can find similar effects throughout politics. Conservatives often paint liberals as anti-religious, yet 83% of Democrats believe in God, very close to the 93% of Republicans that do. Liberals often cast conservatives as indifferent to issues like climate change and wealth inequality, yet a majority of Republicans support climate policies, including a carbon tax, as well as higher taxes on the rich. The effect seems to become even more pronounced at the extremes. Many conservatives seem to believe that feminists hate men, and Black Lives Matter believes that white lives don't. They see the handful of extremists that actually hold those positions and decide that they define the left as a whole. Many liberals seem to believe that any support for border security is rooted in racism, but a majority of Latinos support increased security at the border. Conservatives that do have racist motivations are amplified by left-wing media and are assumed to be representative due to outgroup homogeneity bias. I want to be clear, fringe groups and extremists do exist. Just because they are not a majority doesn't mean they aren't important or potentially dangerous. 23% of Republicans believe in the QAnon conspiracy theory, which claims that the election was stolen and that Democrats are literally satanic pedophiles. This fringe, and others with similar beliefs, were behind the January 6th Capitol riot. However, outgroup homogeneity bias misleads us into thinking that these groups are dominant in our outgroups, and this has an incredibly toxic effect on discourse. It's difficult to overstate just how corrosive outgroup homogeneity bias is towards civil discourse. When the opposing party has already decided what your views really are, attempting to argue otherwise will often fall on deaf ears. Or worse, you'll be labeled a dupe being used by the real interests in your party, or a bad faith actor running cover for them. If you think that everyone on the left secretly wants to eliminate the traditional family and outlaw religion, it's easy to see calls for LGBT acceptance as attacks. If you think the right's actual motivation is authoritarian rule, you will naturally assume that concerns about crime are a front for seizing power. When you distrust your interlocutor's fundamental motivations, compromise or even understanding becomes impossible. When outgroup homogeneity bias has led you to believe your political outgroup is completely uniform, varying positions inside it appear as illogical contradictions or hypocrisy. Additionally, this bias can heighten partisan identity and widen partisan divides. The more a person forms their conception of the outgroup from its most extreme elements, the more strongly they'll identify with their in-group. How can someone on the left identify with the right if they believe it's dominated by bigots? How can someone on the right connect with someone on the left if they believe liberals want to destroy America? This heightens polarization and strips the nuance from political issues, instead creating a mentality of us versus them. When you have defined the outgroup through their most unreasonable members, that outgroup will naturally appear completely unreasonable. Polarization is tearing our societies apart. While there are many factors that drive this polarization, the inability to understand and converse with our political outgroups is a key element to the downward spiral we find ourselves in. If we want to fight against polarization, we'll need to fight against our own biases. This starts with the realization that every group of any appreciable size is highly heterogeneous. Different members will have different values, viewpoints, and ideas. Treating them as a monolith is often harmful to healthy discourse. Don't assume you know how someone thinks or feels based off of a group they belong to, politically or otherwise. Most importantly, every member of a group is not a stand-in for every terrible thing done by a member of that side. When we start from that assumption, productive discussion is almost impossible, and we further the toxic rise of polarization. Instead, listen to what people tell you about their beliefs. Try to engage in good faith. You may find common ground where you wouldn't have expected. If we can take these ideas to heart, it may help heal the rifts that are destroying our society. This has been Triple Interrobang. Thank you for watching. If this video was valuable to you, you can let me know by liking, subscribing, or leaving a comment. Alternatively, you can do something kind for another person you wouldn't ordinarily do. Either option would be appreciated.